When President Kennedy was elected, he had promised to move forward on civil rights fairly quickly. And he actually took a somewhat more cautious approach because a number of the key committees in Congress were controlled by white Southern Democrats. So there are a number of events like the Freedom Rides or the integration of the University of Mississippi, that he was moved a little more slowly than certainly the civil rights community wanted him to. But in 1963 is when things really begin to move forward. He takes a really strong stance at the integration of the University of Alabama. That's when he addresses the nation and calls civil rights a moral issue facing the country. And he puts forward his civil rights legislation. He and members of his administration, they went out of their way, along with the organizers of the march, to make sure that everything was peaceful, that there was plenty of emergency personnel available, even to the level, more of this was Bayard Rustin, who was the organizer of the march, to be sure there was enough water, that there was enough food, that there were enough sanitation facilities. And they went to some extremes. They closed down all the bars in Washington, D.C., because again, they were worried also about the Ku Klux Klan coming in and that there could be an anti-march. So they all went to really extraordinary measures, which I think is partly why the march was so successful. He was in the White House, and he actually met with, they're called the Big Ten leaders and those who spoke. He met with them both before the march and after the march. And then, it was broadcast nationally on all the TV news stations. So he watched from the White House. I think at the meeting before the march, they met really just to be sure that everything would go smoothly and peacefully. And I think President Kennedy wanted to be sure that the language that was used wouldn't, really incite people, but would instead continue this notion of peaceful protest. And then I think the meeting afterwards, there's actually a great sense of relief, celebration about how successful it had been. I think everyone knew, really how moving it had been. He congratulated the leaders, and especially Martin Luther King. And his first comment when they came through the door was to say to Martin Luther King, how moved he was by the I Have a Dream speech. So then the president gave, I think, quite a forthright press conference or press statement, and he basically understood that the march could really help him get this legislation. He used that same language that he had used when he addressed the nation in June, that this was a moral issue facing the country. He had a lovely line that said that it was an issue that was as old as the scriptures and as clear as the Constitution, that our country is founded on the notion that all men are treated equal, that most religions are founded on the idea that all people should be treated fairly and that we should treat one another as we wish to be treated. It was an incredible moment where the civil rights community comes together and the President of the United States has put forward legislation. Congress is there listening. It wasn't an easy thing to get this legislation passed. We've seen today how difficult it is to get controversial legislation passed through a divided Congress, and it was similar at that time. Lyndon Johnson was a master at getting legislation passed, and there's a new biography about that, about exactly what he did. Literally, the moment he knew President Kennedy had passed away, he began to think about how he could use President Kennedy's own death to help get this legislation passed. Lyndon Johnson's first address to Congress and really to the nation, he says that really no memorial would be more fitting to honor the memory of President John F. Kennedy than the swiftest passage of the civil rights legislation for which he fought so long. So I think, if anything, the march is probably the best example of a peaceful protest that really had an incredible difference in our nation's history. Historically, it's just that important moment. It's really almost the high point of the civil rights movement in that traditional classical way of using peaceful protests and civil disobedience to help pass legislation. And so people can look back to the lessons that could be learned from this march about how you can use peaceful demonstrations like this to put forward your agenda.